Thanks ever so much. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm hoping that we will not take, I won't take all of the half an hour, and that there may be some time for questions. So do think about that, and do feel free to put stuff into the chat. So this is about buildings, but I would say this isn't only about buildings. It should never only be about buildings. Andy in his first session was talking about the big picture, and I think it's really important to see buildings as part of the bigger sustainability picture, and within buildings not think about just, for example, solar panels, but thinking about the building as a system that includes not only the building itself but also the people, and I'll be saying a little bit about that. Okay, let's get going. So here's an agenda. We've just had Trinity Sunday, so it seems to be good to sort of do things in threes. I'm going to be talking about some principles. I'm going to then talk about a few practicalities, and then where we can get help. So that's the structure. So the title of the talk, Church Buildings, What on Earth Can We Do? So some of us will sort of throw up our hands, what on earth can we do? But I'd like to sort of deconstruct that question, what on earth we can do, into bits. So if we turn it around and say, what can we do on earth? That, to me, is a much more sort of positive question. And what it does is, firstly, remind us that we're talking about our location. We are theologically, we're not beings that sort of float abstractly across the world. We are located on a particular patch of earth. Caroline was talking about the earthiness of Christianity, and I would say that we are called to a particular place, and that's one of the strengths of the Church of England. Obviously, we I'm sure have folk from other denominations here, but one of the things that makes me very proud to be an Anglican is that we've got this parish system that tethers us to a particular place, and I think there's something that that God relates to well in that context. So on earth, the on earth bit is about location. The whole thing adds up to vocation, and I want to encourage us, as we think about sustainability, to think about it in terms of our broader vocation to our particular location. Now, I want to talk, this may appear a bit off topic, but I think it's important as a background. And this is about the sort of systems thing. So there's a term, living heritage. And this is if you like, a conservation argument. And the reason we're talking about it is that sustainability impacts our buildings. And certainly within the Church of England, a lot of our buildings are listed. And therefore there's a heritage aspect to, there's a joined upness between these two things. And living heritage, this is a quote from Historic England, used to be English Heritage, that Historic England believes that this country's historic places should retain their role as living buildings in the heart of their communities. What it means to be a living building in heritage terms is that it's a changing thing. So this is about whether change to a historic building is possible, acceptable, even desirable from a conservation point of view. And that's something that, so this is an argument about how we approach change, because sustainability, particularly installing sustainability technologies, will inevitably result in some change. We work within a system, a broad system for the churches as a whole of the ecclesiastical exemption. And the Anglican manifestation of that is the faculty system. And the faculty system is governed by a measure. Now, a measure is the Church of England's equivalent to an Act of Parliament. It's a document with legal force. And changing churches is governed by the latest iteration of this, which was done in 2018. And the headline within this legislation is a really important sort of statement about the duty to have regard to a church's purpose. That anybody carrying out functions of care and conservation under this measure, so people like church architects, for example, also Historic England, Victorian Society, everybody must have due regard to the role of a church as a local centre of worship and mission. So I would suggest, we inscribe that on our hearts, if you're going to get engaged with the permissions process, because what that says, that puts front and centre as a headline statement that worship and mission is essential to the way we view our church buildings. And the mission bit is the link with sustainability, and we'll come on to that. I'm sure that's no surprise to us. Yeah, that's a sort of good headline figure. We've also got a statement of ICOMOS, it's a conservation sort of thing, talking about cultural heritage as living and dynamic. And there's this quote from John Henry Newman, different context. He wasn't talking about buildings, he was talking about the early church, but in a higher world, it's otherwise. Here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. My vision for conservation is that the conservation system as a whole, including conservation officers and amenity societies, would come to a place where they see change to a historic church as a good thing, as a positively good thing, because it demonstrates that the building is alive, and therefore the building has a future. So that's a kind of, call me misty-eyed, but that's my kind of vision. So this is part of the context. And the last bit to say is that you in parishes have an expertise in your locality. It comes back to that vocation-location thing. And the system as a whole, the conservation system, is very good at sidelining that expertise. You guys, when you are arguing for change, need to stand up for your locality, because you should, at least, and if you don't, you've got a problem, you should be the ones that can speak for your locality, both physical place and people. So I want to sort of suggest that our relationship with buildings is important, and it's a relationship of dance partners. So church congregation and building, so the two meanings of the word church, are bound together in a dance. And if either of us drags our feet, then we're likely to fall over, which is why it's important that buildings, historic buildings included, should be able to change. So how does that relate to the climate crisis? I would say that we have, it's not difficult to see the responsibilities that we have due to the climate crisis. Our responsibilities to reduce our carbon footprint, for example. But I also see opportunity in this, and I think it's really important to sort of keep that in view. So the net zero carbon target, February 2020, the Church of England General Synod put forward this net zero carbon target. Originally, in the original sort of proposal, it was for 2045. By amendment of the motion, it was agreed that it would be 2030. Now, 2030, oh, that's, that's 7 years off, or whatever it is. Actually, 2030 is knocking on our door. We have got, that's a really, really steep hill to climb. We've got to get going, we've got to be limbering up. We've got to be, sort of getting going now if we stand any chance of doing that. So 2030, really ambitious target. It's not a criticism of General Synod for doing that. I think it's absolutely the right thing to have done, because it concentrates one's mind. Really important little point to add in, there's a different, the target is all about carbon reduction. But carbon reduction is not the only part of the picture. There is also energy saving. So, and some of the things that we do will do, a lot of things will do both of those, but they're not the same. So you can, and it's perfectly possible to create a zero carbon church. So you do, and the two sort of magic ingredients to that are, if you are using a fossil fuel boiler, oil or gas, get rid of that and put in a heat pump of some kind, air source or ground source. So you're heating yourself from electricity. And then the second step is buy all your electricity on a 100% renewables tariff. And bingo, you're most of the way there to becoming zero carbon in the building, in principle. That's not the same as being wise with the energy that you use. So you can be burning electricity to your heart's content and still be claiming to be zero carbon, but that's not the point. We should also be careful about the energy that we use. So turning off the lights, all the kind of that sort of basic stuff, making sure we've got LED lamps, etc. So that's a little sidebar comment. Okay. The key thing about mission and the way sustainability relates to the permissions process for getting change to our buildings is through mission. And within the Anglican community, we have these 5 marks of mission. 5th mark of mission, as I'm sure you know, is to strive and safeguard the integrity of creation, sustain and renew the life of the earth. That is how sustainability fits within the permissions process, because the permissions process is all about the Chancellor, who is the one person who makes the decision within the Anglican system, the Chancellor balancing perceived harm to the building on the one hand, from whatever change we're proposing to make, versus public benefit on the other hand. And public benefit explicitly includes mission. It's that headline statement we started with. So that's the fifth mark of mission is the way in which sustainability claims on the building, claims for change, if you like, get factored into and can work their way through the system. Okay, I want to through the rest of this session, and this is sort of not in sort of any direct order, but I want to introduce you to 3 documents. I'm just sort of flagging them here. The first of them is called The Practical Path to Net Zero Carbon. I'll give you links to it, don't worry about it at the moment. And the second 2 are a pair of documents which are advising architects on sustainability, and I'll tell you why I think that's relevant to everybody, not just architects. Okay, I've gone wrong somewhere. Here we go. There we go. Right. So practicalities. I want to talk about the basics. So what do we think of first when we think about sustainability in buildings? We tend to think in terms of clever technology. We tend to think in terms of solar panels, heat pumps, or whatever it might be. I think, however, we always need to start in a different place. And we starting with some basics. And the first base, it's incredibly unglamorous. But the first basis is the first place to start is that basic stuff that we should be doing anyway. And frankly, many churches are rubbish at. Though I have to say, pot, kettle, black, as an architect who advises lots of churches to clear out their gutters, my own gutters in my own house, I should be giving more attention to those. However, when it comes to church buildings, there is an awful lot of good sustainability work that we can do simply by clearing our gutters and drains. And the reason for that is that a damp building is a building that feels a whole lot colder, and therefore people tend to overheat. And that's because a damp wall, so if your solid wall is damp because water's pouring down the outside or wherever it's getting in, that will be absorbing a lot more of the energy that we are radiating from our bodies and reflecting back a lot less of that energy. So it feels colder. So just fundamental thing, make sure we've got a dry building insofar as we're able to. I know that can be a struggle. Second, we talked about energy supply and we should all be going to 100% renewable on our electricity, because it's a mechanism by which the energy supply industry is able to justify that change and the adoption of renewables. And then just as an example, using less electricity by, for example, creating smaller spaces potentially. Now, that's not a cheap thing to do, but we had a question in one of the workshop sessions earlier. If you've got a very large building, then it may be helpful to create a smaller space within that larger space that you can heat independently. So for example, when you have a smaller meeting or indeed a smaller service, you are able to heat only that part of the building than the whole of it. Or think about means of heating the people rather than heating the building. Again, from our earlier sessions, we've tended to transfer inappropriately a mental mindset from one thing that we know. And this is, when I say we, I talk about we going back 200 years. We have thought, how do I heat my home? Let's heat our church in the same way. So the modern way of doing that is with a gas boiler and radiators, and you pump hot water around, you heat the radiators, you heat the air, we feel comfortable. That's fine in a low ceilinged room, sort of 8-foot ceiling, whatever. In a tall church that has uninsulated walls, it's much more like a sieve than a building enclosure, because there are hundreds of little holes in that, which if you added them all together would add up to sort of a great big hole through which you're losing all of the hot air that you're heating up. So bad solution for a church. How one heats the people, that's a question, but there are all sorts of things. So if you've got pews delivering heat somehow in or around the pews, possibly overhead. If you're bald, you tend to get burnt head, so not so nice. But it might be a mixture of things. There's a trial going on, which is a really interesting one, actually. So if you think of sort of huge church, difficult to heat, cold, relatively small number of people, perhaps, then there's a trial going on using something that's been developed for outdoor dining, where you have a heated cushion. And it's an electrically rechargeable heatable cushion, which delivers its heat in response to somebody sitting on the cushion. So really interesting sort of technology. There's a lady called Catherine Ross in the Church of England who has the role of, part of the role, she's doing this test. So hopefully there'll be more coming out of that, depending on how successful it is in due course. I'm going to pick up the pace because I'm afraid we'll run out of time. The last point is just about balance and thinking about systems. And part of that is seeing both not only the people and the building, but also the churchyard as a combined system. And thinking also, when we think about changing the building, we need to also think about not only the energy we'll save, but also the embodied energy. And that can be quite a difficult thing to calculate. But again, work is going on that centrally. I want to touch on this document, and if you take away anything from this talk, please take away this document. So there's a link to it there, and the slides and the video for this will be available separately. This, I think, is a great document. What it does is try and bridge the gap between recommending things to do to individual churches with the reality that the Church of England has 16,000 of these buildings, and all of them are different. So how can you possibly generate generic guidance that will be responsible? And the answer to that is to band that guidance into different categories. And the practical path to net zero does that into, I think it's 5 categories, and we'll look at those as we go through this slide. So it starts with initial things you can do, and that's things like the basic maintenance, the LED lamps, and where you purchase your electricity from. So low cost and very unglamorous, but that's where everybody should have done that before they think about doing anything else. The next band is where you would go next, and this is for buildings that are used more than just very occasionally. So it's things like possibly insulation in roof voids, possibly creating a second set of doors so that you've got some kind of a draft lobby, possibly that example of creating separately heatable spaces. And then for busier churches that have higher energy use, doing sort of more ambitious projects, possibly sort of photovoltaic panels, possibly LED lighting systems as examples. And then beyond that, this is about the buildings that have the highest energy uses, so the busiest buildings. Thinking about changing your heat source to an air source or a ground source heat pump, for example. Electric vehicle charging points, separate sort of thing, but will become increasingly important. And then it ends with a category of things that generally one wouldn't do. For example, in a historic church, one wouldn't think about double glazing. That's an example of that. Okay. I then want to get on to the help section. So there's the last section, but there's a number of sort of bits to this. So again, Trinitarian theme, 3 web resources to start with. Obvious place to start is EcoChurch. Now, EcoChurch is not the answer to all our problems in terms of sustainability, but it is a fantastic tool. My description of it, cobbling together various bits of text, is that it equips us to demonstrate that the gospel is good news for God's earth. So we're in the business, as churches, we should be in the business of spreading good news. The issue with sustainability, and this comes back to the opportunity as well as the responsibility. The opportunity here is that sustainability is demonstrably good news for all sorts of people in our culture who would ordinarily have nothing to do with the church. So I see this as a huge mission opportunity. If the Church of England, of all people, can position, if we can position ourselves as champions of sustainability, including changing our historic church buildings, pushing the conservation argument in favor of conservation, in favor of sustainability, then that is, I think, a real witness to the culture as a whole. You'll probably know, those of you that don't, it's divided into 5 categories: worship and teaching, church buildings, church land, community and global engagement, and lifestyle. I see the value of eco-church as us not living in pockets. So the broad view, and it is a fantastic way of once you start engaging with it, and I've frankly only recently started in the context of my own church being involved in engagement with it. But it gives you all sorts of prompts. It gets you thinking about the sort of things you should do. What you shouldn't do is look to it for a specific menu of things to do to your church building, because, as I say, that comes back to needing to differentiate between what's appropriate on your church building versus general guidance. So it's at the general level, but it's a really, really useful tool. So thoroughly, heartily recommended. Second resource, Church Care. Now, Church Care is the Church of England's sort of brand label, if you like, for guidance on buildings, particularly historic buildings, because that's where the issues are. And within Church Care, there's a net zero carbon church area, and that's where you will find that the practical path to net zero, for example. There are 6 areas within this particular web page. It's just a web page, but it's a sort of route into all of the guidance. These are the 6 areas, including, as I say, the practical path to net zero. The graphic is just, it's a nice little, what's the word? It's clickable. They're clickable links to sort of guide you through sort of various bits of guidance, point you to, it's a signposting mechanism. It's just nice, somebody's put some effort into the visuals. Again, Catherine Ross is the lady behind all of these sort of things. And crucially, it gives you access to further information, including webinars, advice and support. So that's a kind of central point there. And then the third thing, again, this is Church of England only, forgive us others from other denominations. As part of the online faculty system, there is a map, an interactive map that will show you where different forms of sustainability technology have been implemented in different places. The beauty of this map, and I have to say, so health warning with it, the information is not perfect, so you don't take it as gospel. It relies on, I presume it's dioceses that need to upload the information, so it's patchy in terms of how well it's uploaded, I think, and there are 1 or 2 errors. If it says that a church has done X thing, do check. But the beauty of it is that it's a way of finding people near you who have done something similar to what you might be thinking about. And the beauty of it is that you can search by these different criteria that you can see at the top there. You can search by diocese, so you can search for people in your immediate locality. You can search as well, or instead, by listing grade. So you could look for all of the grade 1 listed buildings that have done renewable stuff within your diocese, or indeed within another diocese. Or you can search for all of the ones that have implemented a particular technology. So you can say, I want to see all of the ones that have done wind turbines. Now, the answer to that is probably none, quite rightly, because wind turbines is not a great thing, apart from perhaps a very coastal situation. You might argue that's a good sort of thing to do. But generally speaking, we shouldn't be putting wind turbines on our historic churches. But that map there, I think it's the case that the little sun icons are photovoltaic installations, and the circles are heat pump installations. And most of those heat pump installations will be air source heat pumps. But you can do a search. You can find out what has been recorded. Really powerful tool. I thoroughly recommend it. Okay. The third Trinitarian structure, people. Think about the people whom one can approach. Firstly, DAC, talk to your DAC, because the DAC should absolutely be your friend in this. Second, talk to your diocesan environmental officer if you have one. Most dioceses do. We in Ely have instead a task group instead of an officer, which has some advantages and some disadvantages. But there will be somebody trying to fly the flag for sustainability. Note that environmental officers tend to be from either a buildings type sustainability carbon reduction background or a biodiversity background. So you need to understand where they're coming from, but they're a good signpost to other things. And the third person is your architect, who also should be your friend, because every church has an inspecting architect. The advantages of your church architect is that it's an existing relationship. Hopefully it's a good relationship, don't know. You have this inspection regime every 5 years. And they should be, question mark, whether they are, understanding living heritage, i.e. the connection between you as a community and your building. They should help you with that relationship. And if they aren't able to do that, and some church architects are only interested in what you've got as a historic building, then maybe you should be thinking about whether they're the right people for your job, depending on what it is that you want to do. So there's a sort of urge, much as I love church architects, I am one, you do need to push your church architect to make sure that they're the right person for the job. Last bit, this is just some introduction this is more to signpost you to some guidance that has been prepared for church architects between the Church of England and ESA, which is Church Architects Organisation. And there's a document for church projects, and there's a document for quinquennial inspection. So the guidance was split into two bits. The point of pointing you to this is twofold. One, make sure that your church architect knows about this, and if they don't, ask why they don't. Secondly, it's quite useful stuff to download yourself and use, and anybody can download it and use it to inform your approach to both how you relate to the church architect, but also you'll pick up some good stuff. And this guidance is tied in very much to the practical path to net zero. Just as a sort of final thing, I wanted to throw another quote at you. This is returning to the big picture of treating church buildings and people as systems. And this quote from Winston Churchill: "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." And my question to this generation, as it is how are we going to shape our buildings in response to the climate crisis to make the building better in terms of sustainability, and indeed our church presence within our communities more sustainable in a community sense. And there's that image of the dancers, which I think is a good guiding image. So I'm afraid we've got no time for questions, but back to the organisers. Thank you.